Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokpariola. These are critical times with evolving sets of complicated challenges in Africa as a political dictatorship remains a threat to the essence of democracy, ensuring that events of resistance are largely inevitable. Recent days of massive protests in Togo left the world in shock with very disturbing images from the small West African nation where only 2 people from one family have been in power since 1967. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on political developments in Togo following recent protests against the 50-year-old Eyadema dynasty? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
On Saturday, thousands of Togolese took to the streets, demanding democratic reforms and the restoration of the country's 1992 constitution. Chanting 50 years is too long, many are calling for change after half a century of rule by the Nasingbe family. The protests were largely peaceful, but in the town of Sokode, near the capital, Lome, security forces opened fire to disperse demonstrations. Officials say 2 protesters were killed and 12 soldiers wounded, but some claim the number might be higher. The demonstrations brought back memories of protests that followed Foreigner Singbe's first election victory in 2005, in which more than 500 people were killed. President Foreigner Singbe has been in power since the 2005 death of his father, Nasingbe Eyadema, who had been at the helm for 38 years. The 1992 constitution brought in a multi-party democracy after decades of dictatorship, but after 10 years, lawmakers amended it to enable Eyadema run for another term. Then when he died, the military effectively tore up the constitution by installing his son as interim president instead of the head of the National Assembly as was legally required. Now, with disillusionment at the status quo growing, Togo's usually fragmented opposition is coming together in a long overdue show of unity. Emboldened and invigorated, Togolese citizens are gearing up for what some are calling a final assault to break the wall of oppression.
Judging from what has happened, if the march is allowed at all, the security for the march would perhaps be beefed up. And it's also likely that we will see a crackdown on opposition leaders before the day of the march or during the march, because that has been the trajectory of Togo since Foreigner Yasingbe took over office from his father.
This weekend, they will try again and have vowed to keep pushing until they overcome.
Welcome back. In the last 50 years, Togo has been ruled by a single family after Sergeant Eyadema Nasibe overthrew President Sylvanus Olympio in 1963 and toppled Nicholas Grunitzky 4 years later to become the head of state in what was the beginning of a long rule. And after 38 years of rule, Eyadema died and was replaced by his son, Foreigner Nasibe, a move supported by France with the backing of a few African leaders like former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo and Senegal's Abdoulaye Wade. Joining me in the studio on Africa Today, I have Dr. Austin Mweze, Senior Lecturer, School of Political Science at the Pan-Atlantic University. And on Skype, I have Benjamin Lawrence, Editor-in-Chief, African Studies Review and Professor of History at the University of Arizona, United States. Good to have you gentlemen on the program.
Thank you.
Now let me begin with you, Austin. Let's look at this recent developments in Togo. What do you make of it, especially as it concerns the Eyadema dynasty?
Well, if you go back in history, you'll find that, the way the colonial masters, left Africa. They left Africa in a state that they will not be able to govern themselves. And, especially the French, you know, their own method of assimilation and stuff. In 1963 or 65, the French government granted about 11 to 13 African countries independence. At some point, they devastated nothing, no training about the governance, nothing about development and all that, because there was this struggle for power. And then even those that are installed in power, if a government is not favorable to the French interests or the British interests, they unseat the person. Okay, so you see that happening. The Yadema dynasty, you know, toppled the leaders to become this, and they were supported by the French because those people were not playing the game; they're playing along or protecting the French. Felt that their interest was being threatened, and being a French colony is dangerous for them. So, and that was the genesis of them supporting, you know, all this the dynasty. And don't forget, no dynasty, you know, has in the past few years after, you know, the Ottoman, the King Farouk of Egypt, you know, the Ottoman that ruled Egypt. After that, no dynasty has succeeded or lasted more than 50 years. You know, there's bound something to, you know, something is bound to happen, to give way. And don't forget, Africa today is not Africa
of yesterday,
the 60s and 50s.
So definitely this is more like it's expected to happen.
Exactly.
In a way.
What happened in the Middle East? Nobody expected it, but it happened. Okay? And don't forget the role of the social media, you know, in all of this, in enlightening. People are getting educated. They're no longer, you know, illiterates. So these are some of the things that contributed to this uprising today.
All right. Now, Benjamin, you've just heard Austin's point of view, but what do you make of Togo under Ayademe's 50 years of rule?
Well, the Ayadema clan, let's be specific. It's one of his many sons. By some accounts, the now deceased, the late President Ayadema had maybe as many as 50 children by different wives and other women. So there is one of the sons is in charge, and there are other sons that could be in charge. One is in jail for having fomented a coup against his brother or his half-brother. But yes, it's a clan rule, and it's been going on for, as you said, 50 years. I wouldn't necessarily describe what's going on as a revolt or revolution. It's only one of many protests that episodically erupt in Togo. And they've had varying degrees of success over the years. I mean, there were attempted coups against the president, Ayadema, and there was in fact a relatively peaceful constitutional reform in the early 90s where he ceded power, but then he violently came back to power and overturned the constitutional convention and seized power again. And then he ran for election and re-election, and his son is doing the same thing. I was in Togo when Jacques Chirac visited and extracted from the president a concession. That's Ayadema, the late president, extracted from him a concession to accede to term limits. And he did that, of course. I don't really think he would have honored that commitment, but he died before we were really able to see what was going to pan out. But then his son was bound by term limits which have subsequently been undone. And we've seen this happen in a number of countries. In Benin, the former president tried to do that, and of course it was hastily beaten back. But we've seen it successfully overturned in places like Burundi. So the type of pressure that can be brought to bear on countries to adhere to term limits is very limited. There's very little capacity outside forces have to pressure countries to adhere to term limits. But as we saw from Gambia, ECOWAS can have quite a powerful role in shaping what comes next.
Quite interesting there with ECOWAS shaping that. You know, but if you look at this very closely, Austin, we had African leaders in support of Nasibe, you know, coming in to take over, rather to maintain his stand as the ruler of Togo for a longer period of time. And you also have Senegal's president supporting the same move. So how much of a role do you think African Union or African regional bodies can, you know, change things in Togo and support the voice of the people which says that they are tired of Ayademe's dynasty? Yeah,
I think why the African heads of state supported the, you know, the son to take over, you know, to avoid any kind of vacuum, to give time for a proper election to be held, okay? And when, with the support of the military, he still managed to, to retain power to date, which is not right. Because the people were expecting that, okay, agree that your father died suddenly, and nature abhors vacuum, and then for interim purposes, now you are a substantive president. And they waited, nothing happened. And instead, apart from all the coups, the family coups that happened within, instead of really looking into that and conducting proper election and opening up the political space for a lot of people to participate, now he closed up the political space and using the military as a backup. There's only, it's not a matter of time before this will happen, before this kind of thing will happen. And it's going to snowball to something that is even heavier, if care is not taken. So
we do not expect anything difficult or something,
is going
tragic
to the
happen,
French,
except that something is really done
exactly
before it gets out of hand.
Yes.
Well, let's quickly go on a break. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at political developments in Togo following recent protests against the 50-year-old Eyadema dynasty. Welcome back. From Senegal to Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso to Gambia, current events in Togo are seen as a continuation of a movement that have shaken one regime after another across West Africa in the last 5 years. And just as it is in Togo, a similar political dynasty exists in Gabon, where you have Ali Bongo as president, who, along with his father, Omar Bongo, have consecutively ruled the French-speaking nation since 1967. Now, Benjamin, let's look at the strength of the opposition politics in Togo. How do you think, or rather, what's your thoughts on how they've evolved over the years, and what do you make of their demands?
Well, as I understand it, most of the demands that are being made are to return to some of the constitutional constraints that were disbanded several years back. So, in order for that to take place, it requires the unicameral, that's the single chamber, assembly to make those changes, but the vast majority of seats in that assembly are controlled by the government. The opposition is very disunited in Togo and has been for decades. So I don't quite see it. I don't quite see what's going on as somehow part of a larger regional transformation. I think this is yet another episodic instance of civil demonstrations brutally suppressed by government, which has been taking place for decades in Togo. And their demands, that is, the demands of the opposition, while obviously merit-worthy and constitutional, are very narrow and actually not particularly innovative or original. And so what you see is the types of demands that have been made many times before. What the Togolese government is very good at, what Eyadema was good at and what his son is good at, is co-opting members of the opposition. So for a long time, the opposition was led by Gilchrist Olympio, the son of the first president who was murdered, probably, by the first Eyadema. But now he's a member of the government. He's joined the governing party, governing regime. And so the main opposition party splintered and reformed under a new name and a new banner. So I don't really hold out much optimism. I don't share the optimism of your other guest that this is something that is going on more broadly and will sweep away the Eyadema regime. I'm one of many people who've predicted that would happen several times in the past, and it hasn't.
Really? And what were the indices you gave out to, predict this much?
Would you say that again?
How are you able to predict this much from what you just said?
Well, I'm a historian, and so I turn back to the historical developments in Togo over the last 20 years, and the past practices and past behaviors are the best predictor of future activities. As far as I'm concerned, you can see in Togo that the government, the government party, is in entire control of both the government, the courts, the military, the paramilitary, the police. It controls the economy. Members of the ruling family control the ports, control the airport, control leading businesses. There isn't really any avenue whereby key opposition figures can gain much of a foothold in a civil, economic, or social society. They're constantly marginalized. And then every so often, a prominent individual is co-opted and joins the government as a minister of such and such, builds himself a fancy villa, and expropriates funds from the government coffers, as do most ministers. So there isn't really much in the past that suggests something radical is about to happen. We can always hope.
All right, now, Benjamin, from what you just say now, I can't really say much, but it seems like from what he's analyzing, it's more like a tall order, for the Togolese or the opposition, so to speak, to have the Nasibe family or dynasty, so to speak, out of Togo's politics.
Yeah, because one is the system or the style of African leaders is they get into use political power to acquire personal wealth, and then use the same wealth to oppress the people. So it depends on how the kind of financial muscle the opposition has to sustain this, because you find that there's so much poverty in Togo, just like every other African country, and poverty, illiteracy, and democracy, they don't mix. If you're not educated, democracy is sophisticated, and if the system does not empower you, the wealth of the Togolese are in the hands of few, and again, it could be some kind of a carrot, if you are in the opposition, and they can throw it in, just the same style that the colonial masters used, to throw in this thing and promise you that you're going to acquire wealth and live comfortably well if you join us. It happens in Nigeria too. And many African countries. Okay,
but how do you think they can sustain the tempo, even though it seems like, well, there is no way out of this? It's more like we're going to see the same story happen as it has happened before. So how can they sustain this tempo so that they can really get what they want?
One is that those kids on the street, if they're able to feed them, if they're able to provide some kind of support, financially speaking. It depends on how financially, buoyant and well off the opposition is, because what they do is to, kind of extract or deprive, make sure that the opposition don't have money. And once you don't have money, you don't do politics.
But in the midst of this difficulty, where can they meet a headway?
Now, what they could do, in effect, is that look. Keep calling for this, okay? Keep pressing them, be more innovative. Keep pressing for their demands and see how they can come to a negotiating table. you know, so that they can actually move forward. They don't have guns. They control the military. They control the police. You know, they control all the both the security forces. So it will be difficult. It's a tall order, but it's doable.
It's doable.
Yes, it's doable.
I like that.
Yeah, because if it could happen, history has told us that if it could happen in other countries, you know, it's just one little somebody burning himself. But I tell you, this will not go away. If they don't get it now, you know, because they didn't get it before, they keep pushing. One day, it may be 10 years, it may be 15 years, maybe 20 years. Oh yeah, of course. So, but definitely, there must be a change in Togo.
So, Benjamin, Faro's mandate ends in 2020, but what do you think are his chances of standing again for another re-election?
Well, I think they're very high. I don't think at this moment in time there's going to be anything that's going to stop him running again. At the same time, for anything to really change in that regard, it would require both internal and external pressures. So it is the case that internal economic pressures could be brought to bear. The opposition in other countries, let's think about, for example, Tunisia and others, have successfully brought ruling regimes to their knees by sort of a general strike. So things like that can work. At the same time, the opposition in Togo is also very heavily tied to the south. And the events of the most recent violent events took place in the north, or in the central north, the Sokoto region. And so what that says to me is that there is tensions throughout the country. And last year there was violence in Mangu in the very north. And so rather in the past, a lot of the pressures were regional and southern, and the government was able to suppress opposition by using particularly sort of ethnicized levers of power. It may be the case that ethnic unity, or the ethnic power that the Adama clan and its Kabila kinsmen have wielded for so long, is starting to dismantle. External forces can also be brought to bear. So let's say France's foreign policy shifts and they really dig their heels in about term limits. And they haven't done that in many countries, but they could do it. They certainly got involved very heavily in Ivory Coast, in Senegal, and in Benin. And it's possible that with a certain amount of external pressure, it could be brought to bear that those term limits could be reinstated and adhered to. At the same time, France is the biggest trading partner for Togo. All the military hardware, all the police, paramilitary equipment is purchased directly from France. And so, let's be honest, why would France have a particularly good interest in dismantling that steady chain of economic activity?
That's another question for another day, but let me leave it for now with you, then Benjamin Lawrence, Editor-in-Chief, African Studies Review and Professor of History at the University of Arizona, United States. We'd like to thank you very much indeed for your contributions on the program. So, well, according to Benjamin, external pressure could bring, Togo to its knees, so to speak. And, well, there's a lot of, something at stake between France and Togo here in terms of economic advantage. But in a nutshell, what lessons can Africa learn from the happenings in Togo and, of course, developments thereof?
Now, let me take it this way. Now, it will be difficult for France. It's all about interests. The French, what is their interests? As long as this present government keeps, meeting that interest, they might as well rule forever. But unless they go east, China, Russia, and some of these other countries that are opposed to the Western, interests, that is the only way they can achieve. But for France to intervene when their interest is protected with this government, it will be difficult. Okay, it will be difficult, but it's achievable. Now, the lesson we have to learn is that, look, for African leaders, that they can no longer, we have left the Stone Age. We have left this is the knowledge economy. You know, and the media is playing a big role in all of this. Technology is also playing a big role. That they should look at the yearnings of the people, provide good governance. It does not cost much to do all of this, okay? They should empower their people so that by the time it's easier, you know, to really lead a literate population than illiterate population. They find it more difficult. So it's better they provide good governance for their citizens and have an inclusive government, and not the type that a select few, 1% of the population will control 98% of the wealth, of national wealth. And that is the only way. It's just a matter of time. You know, as we move on to the 22nd century, it will be more difficult for African dynasties or clans to retain power and treat the people the way. For as long as people get more educated, more sophisticated, you know, they are definitely going to ask for their political rights. And until that is done, and also to really change the political system, not what the Western nations, you know, want us to, the kind of system they want us to have. We should evolve an African, you know, democracy, more or less, so that we'll be able to, something that will take care of, take into consideration our heritage, our culture.
Right.
Democracy as it is now is alien to us, to our
Indeed.
culture.
So we need to apply the change that
Exactly.
has come to stay in our continent, Africa. Thanks a lot, Dr. Austin Weze, Senior Lecturer, School of Political Science at the Pan-Atlantic University. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
As it stands, Togo faces a fork in the road between hollow stability and enduring democratic values as the legacy of a dynasty finds itself on a collision course with resolute minds who have vowed to keep pushing until they overcome. It remains unknown if protests in Togo would spark a similar reaction in countries like Cameroon and the DR Congo, but lessons from history has shown that no tyrant is beyond justice and no dictator is indispensable. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Makwariola, and always remember, change starts with you.